First I'm going to show you the way to prepare the tissue paper for the paper cloth experiments. I start with even used tissue paper. You just need to press it to get all the wrinkles and the fold marks in it, and then kind of roughly cut it a little bit bigger than the size of your a piece of bond paper that will fit in your printer. That way you don't have a lot to mess with when you're trimming it down. To mount it to the bond paper, you're going to put your paper down. A piece of scrap paper is fine. And then put the tissue paper just a little bit off the top edge and use a piece of masking tape that covers right up to the edge and then also attaches the tissue paper. That way it will go through your printer without a glitch, in theory. We've got this down. Then the next thing is to trim it off so that your tissue is and your masking tape are exactly the size of your paper, your bond paper. So I'm using just a clear plexiglass ruler, but you could use any kind of straight edge. The main thing is to make sure that when you finish it, you've got, you know, your tissue is exactly the size of your paper. Okay, next step will be to print this out, and then when we have all of our tissue printed, I'll show you how to make the paper cloth. Okay, once you have decided what you're going to mix, you're going to use about half. Good idea to shake it up first. Going to mix it about half and half water and medium till you get about the consistency of thick cream, but not too thick, because you want it to really, if you use it too thick, you just end up with a big globby kind of mess. Usually at this point then, I will take my waterproof surface. This is just a piece of cardboard with some plastic over it, and I'm going to put a layer of my thin medium on top of it. It just sort of disappears, but you'll know where it is because it's sticky. And then put my fabric down on top of that. If you don't want to peel glue off of your fingers for the next 2 hours, you might want to use some little rubber gloves. I just usually don't bother. And then you put another layer of your thin medium on top of the fabric. And start adding layers of the tissue and other elements that you want to have incorporated into this paper cloth. The reason you want to make paper cloth is if you just try to sew tissue paper or cloth, tissue paper or other papers, they just fall apart because the needle holes are too close and you can't really get an image that sticks on there. But once you have something that's on a tissue and has been adhered to cloth, it stitches just as though it were cloth. And you can cut these out, and you're going to make a collage in just pretty much the same manner you make any kind of collage. Once you put it down, you do another quick layer. If you want to make sure that the images don't bleed at all, you may want to spray them lightly with a a polyethylene clear spray. I'm not going to bother on this because we're just learning kind of the technique, and actually I sort of like it sometimes when things smear around. So every layer gets another little batch of stickiness on there. And use other elements that I did. It's kind of like making a piece of flat paper mache. And the more layers you put on it, the kind of denser your fabric will be, but the easier it'll be to kind of hold it together when you start stitching through it. And the nice thing is that because the tissue paper is somewhat transparent, even when you layer another color on top of it, you just get a little blending of the different colors. You can still see what's underneath it. I can even take pieces of regular printed text and use those as one of my sandwiches of images. You can see, just doing this in a really fast composition of color. You can, of course, be much more intentional and cut shapes out, or there's wonderful little squares of tissue paper you can buy. They're fun to use in this process. I like to make sure that, I've got elements of the same color that go through the whole piece of collage, because that ties the composition together. Oops. Mess over here. It's okay. There's also some tissue paper bleeds and other tissue paper doesn't bleed. So when you start working with it, you may find that you're getting, the colors are going to mix together, and that's another kind of interesting part of the process. The more expensive tissue papers don't. You can also use scraps of, tissue paper that has word on it, or text that are already part of the printing of the tissue. Just be sure that you've covered all those edges as you go down, because you don't want them to peel up. Generally, when I finish a piece off, I take a piece of white or light colored tissue and put it over the whole thing or over most of it, and that will sort of put this sandwich of images together. Now that it will dull some of those colors, so you may decide you don't want to do that, but you'll be surprised at how transparent they kind of stay. We'll do this sort of half with it and half without, so you can see the difference once it dries. And the next step is just to let dry air and sunshine do its work, and once it's finished, I can show you how the finished project can be stitched and sewn. There we go. After your paper fabric, hot paper has dried, it'll be kind of stuck to your background with plastic. And when you peel it off, you can see you have something that can be folded, it can be cut, it can be stitched. You can take a cutting knife and trim it into strips and then reassemble them. The only kind of caution I would say is use a big fat stitch when you sew it together, because that'll keep it in better shape than if you take little tiny stitches with your sewing machine. And probably use a fairly heavy duty needle, like a jeans needle, and don't worry too much if you have to pick something out. You'll still have little holes in there, but that's okay. But it really is quite cloth-like, and yet you've got, there's your words and your collage. We'll see what that turns into next. Here's a piece I did on a thicker piece of fabric, and you can see, though it's still much the same. It's really important to get all those little edges glued down as you work on these, so that they don't peel off on your work.